Pedro Almodovar, perhaps best known for art house triumphs like Voltaire and Pain and Glory, began his career in the ashes of the Franco regime. A new Spain, liberated politically and sexually, made room for the prolific Pedro to innovate the Spanish soap opera with Hitchcockian grandeur and Bergmanesque introspection. Our story begins in 1985 with Matador, a sexy slasher thriller about bullfighting prowess and power. Antonio Banderas plays a nervous wannabe whose attempted rape of his maestro's lover complicates a murder case. Law of Desire is a love triangle with a dark edge. A handsome gay director is haunted by his sister's traumas and harassed by a controlling lover. Banderas again, keeping it clingy. Women on the Verge of a Nervous Breakdown is about just that. A Shiite terror plot, a burnt mattress, 2 spurned women, a bottle of gazpacho in the fridge. Need I say more? Probably, but we don't have time. With Tie Me Up, Tie Me Down, Banderas is back, more possessive than ever. Obsession takes him to the dressing room of former adult actress Marina, whose love he won't rest without. But will his dead-eyed devotion win over this pornographic princess? Just give him enough rope. You're listening to MoobTube, a podcast for gored matadors and lachrymose lovers. Owen and I are joined this week by 2 special guests, 2 Almodovar obsessives, Matt Copson and Luci Bull. Luci, where did your Almodovar adventure begin?
I think that I first saw Voltaire in theaters when I was 16. But, my memory fails me. And then... But I think I always liked it, and then I saw certain of the 90s ones. But yeah, it's really those earlier ones that really kind of got me obsessed. I'm curious, Matt, what was your first Almodovar?
I'm trying to remember. I can't actually remember. I think it might have been Voltaire as well, which kind of fits our age, finding out about the one. But I remember seeing All About My Mother as well, and I took Spanish at school just so I could watch his films, because I knew it was part of the syllabus. I didn't really have that.
How good is your Spanish?
Not good. Shiite. But I was more interested in writing about the films than I was learning the language. But I then watched all of them as a teenager, and I've kind of returned to them lots of times. I don't really rewatch that many films, but his I do. And
I'm the same way.
Yeah.
You were both talking about it as like a place of comfort, right? Like, I think the word was like hangover cinema, almost at one point. Like, these are...
I think I called it therapeutic too.
I think part of what makes his films so easy to watch is just how narratively rigorous they are, and there's just this amazing... I mean, it's the quality of a perfect farce, and it made me think a little bit about Curb Your Enthusiasm, actually, in that every little object and idea that is placed in your mind in the first 10 minutes comes back later on in the film to be completed as a motif or an idea. So that's so obviously the case in Matador, where you have this amazing hairpin that is like sunk into the flesh of these various victims, and that hairpin kind of recurs throughout the film as a way of signaling this darkness between these 2 people.
Yeah. There's this joke about the Oscars, which is that you should replace best with most in every category, which is obviously very true. It's like, what's going to win? Most sound design, most editing, most acting.
Most
and
objects.
In the case of Almodovar, it's actually true, and that's what makes it accessible. It is most plot, most acting, most colour, yet he's in control of those things, and Hollywood rarely is. And I think that's what makes him so auteurist in his kind of extreme accessibility. Everything is kind of pushed to its natural conclusion aesthetically.
I think the word you used, Ralph, was obviousness, I think.
Yeah, he's really good at obviousness. There's there's an amazing in improv storytelling, there's an amazing phrase like, don't be original, be obvious. Oftentimes when people are improvising, they try and come up with funny ideas, random ideas, but the best thing to do narratively is always the most obvious thing. Who's at the door? It's your mother.
It's heightened to this extreme constantly.
In Matador, at the beginning, it's so on the nose. The masturbation, sex, the goring of a bull, or like the description of the bull being like an act of love, and we see people having sex, and then we see the bull ring. It's all, everything is like
the matador is masturbating over like women being cut up and stuff.
It's fiction, right? It's all, the whole plot is there in the first, encapsulated, and for everything that the film will contain is shown to you on a platter, and it's everything throughout the film is surfaced, and it's like how you, nothing is hidden, nothing, even though the films often center around like repression and hidden traumas. Everything is there. Like the whole world is like on the surface up for grabs, which is what makes them kind of like quite intimidating, which is what I didn't get when I first saw What About Your Mother. When I see it now, I'm like, actually these are quite intricate constructions. Like storyboarding these films must have been like quite chaotic.
I think it's also quite funny when you compare it to the contemporary art house aesthetic, which is a cliche all unto itself at this stage, which is prizing itself upon this idea of ambiguity in direct relation or like antagonism to the kind of American mainstream cinema. But within that, you often find this kind of obvious wishy-washy, everything could mean everything, which is also tedious and boring and not very truthful. And I think there's something that I really respond to in a lot of things, which is like actively tackling archetypes and the cliches that exist all around us, like confronting them directly and using those. And then, because I don't think the end point of an Almodovar film is obvious, because the journey he ends up taking you on is anything but. He just takes those archetypes seriously and lets them all clash with one another until you get to this point of originality and newness. And I think that's what makes him so utterly postmodern, but that also shows us that that's not like a kind of defeatist end point, that there's like a lot that can come out of that, but it's more truthful to engage with those heavy archetypes all the time and be direct.
I feel like, I mean, he's using these archetypes because like it's more about sort of like the emotional drive that these characters have in their life, and and how they navigate sort of these decisions and actions. And I think that's why he like makes all these male characters these like dopey psychopaths, and it's just like whittling down sort of the theme in a certain way so that you can just get lost in like the kind of the metaphor of it. And I mean, it's like so interesting to me that in our film club discussion, like after Matador, that people are like, we're talking mostly about like the narrative, because when I watch, I guess in general, when I watch movies, I'm looking at the light and color first and foremost as like a painter, and like the tone and like the momentum and pacing of everything. But with Almodovar, I feel like you're sort of just lost in the dumbness of it.
It's true, because the way that again that obviousness floats up is that maybe you could say that it's something about, I'm going to make a crass generalization about Spanish society now, but I don't care. The Spanish society after Franco has experienced a long period of disappearance, repression. Add into that Catholicism, and a particularly like visually erotic form of Catholicism, which really, like Spanish Catholicism really is way more erotically charged than like Italian Catholicism. Right? It's bright, it's vibrant, it's like full of symbols, blood, sex, all that shit. And he's kind of like, Almodovar I think was like going to train as a priest or something like that. And obviously he did the flip side of that, which is like producing quite transgressive cinema. Mm-hmm. So he's already operating in a world where symbols are dense and loaded with kind of these repressed urges which are hidden just below the surface. You've got literal political repression and disappearances and kind of like unresolved guilt. And then you make a cinema often about things which are quite shocking, or the fact of showing like homosexual relationships, or talking about like transsexuals, or talking about kind of like even just like showing sex in a purely erotic way rather than a sacred way, is quite daring. And then that for me is one of the reasons why he kind of like in his early films, at least, particularly Matador, it's all there. It's all totally front loaded. And he kind of flips Spanish, I guess, bourgeois norms on the head a little bit, because even when, is it Angelo, like Banderas's character at the very beginning, like he's training to be a matador, but he's also kind of like trying to have sex for the first time. He's a literal virgin. So again, kind of Banderas, Almodovar is like uniting all these kind of combined drives. So this is like him, I guess, inverting Spanish society in a really kind of like mad way. It's good. That's why it's very good. I mean, that's why maybe the intensity is lost on me a bit. Probably if I was like watching this in the cinema in like, 1985, 1986, Spain, it probably would have felt very explosive.
It might be a good point to bring in Almodovar's very first film, which I think me and Lucy watched in the last 24 hours, Pepi, Luci, Boom, which is like made on 16mm. It's got quite an indie feel in comparison to his other work, even though the production design is still sparkling and bright and bold. But yeah, it's about these three friends. One of them is a lesbian punk. One of them is a very hyper submissive housewife of a policeman, and the other is this woman Pepi, who becomes an ad executive after having her virginity taken by this policeman husband of Luci, and they form this kind of unlikely friendship. And there are lots of moments of like, I guess, very obvious transgression, like a moment where like the bomb pisses on Lucy's face, and like just in like a kind of social situation. There's a penis judging contest called General Erections. Which I don't know what the Spanish is for that, but that's like a very good pun in English.
It's very
good. But yeah, there's a penis judging competition, and the guy with the largest and thickest penis gets to request any woman in the room to do something to it.
Do anything he wants.
Yeah. And Lucy gets picked. The most, the submissive cop's wife is brought forward to fillet him. But yeah, I guess that film. Yeah, Lucy, what did you think of that film? It was quite an exciting watch, wasn't it? It was quite like, it felt very fresh, and it's quite disliked as well by sort of chin stroking critics.
I mean, it has like so many of the same themes that he sort of brings up in all of his movies, but then it's like obviously way lower budget and like very like playful and comedic.
Felt a bit John Waters in a way, like
totally. That's exactly what I told Jackie afterwards. I was like, John Waters. I loved it. Like there were so many hilarious moments, and it, like I never wanted it to end. And directly after watching it, I then watched Pain and Glory, and so it was like kind of a bit of a shock. It wasn't my first time watching Pain and Glory. I did see that one in theaters last year, right before COVID hit. I was actually like the only person in the theater, which was
beautiful,
really weird. I almost felt ripped off. Like you go to the movies to be surrounded by people and see how they interact, but it was also I thought like an incredible sort of take on a memoir, Pain and Glory, and he's matured in so many different ways that but at the same time I'll always be more of a sucker for those early films.
I think you can basically divide his career into these like 3-4 sections now, and maybe Pain and Glory also, and maybe Giulietta to some degree, feel like they might be starting like another one, which is a kind of much more minimalist thing. But the cool thing is that the content is basically all the same, and the themes are still there, but it's just like this formal shift going on. You've got like these really messy early ones, and then you see like his style sort of ripening a bit into like Matador, where it's like more of a kind of considered film, and then you've got just like the absolute like fun and chaos of Women on the Verge, Law of Desire, Tie Me Up, and then Flower of My Secret, like over into kind of Voltaire is this other kind of like big period. He's just so yeah, it's so impressive to have somebody like who's pulled off that over such a long period of time. There are so few directors I can think of who've kept a consistency and a change going on, which is great. But a fun fact about Pepi, Luci, Bon, it was like shot over like several years, and the house that they're in, they kept on having to change the house, so the interior is just shifting loads, which I really like, and they're just redecorating it to look the same,
like the original house. Wow.
Yeah,
that's awesome.
I mean, it's funny. Like, I guess we've been having this conversation in our film club a lot when looking at things through the historical lens, particularly with transgression, which is such a moving target and culturally specific one. Some of these things, the shocking thing is that some of these things are still transgressive, like showing penises on film is still transgressive, which is just pathetic. But the other elements of it aren't. And my mum actually lived in Madrid right on the cusp of Franco. She was there when Franco died, and it does just sound like the culture war we have now is nothing compared to the generational conflict that was going on there. I mean, there's still, when his tomb was exhumed the other year, there were still protesters there, which is hard to believe. But the country is still massively divided over that legacy. To respond to that with a penis judging competition is just the best thing that art can be.
There's been no peace and conciliation process in Spain, to my knowledge. So there has been in other countries that have had a similarly divisive like civil war, political war. Like South Africa had, like, immediately after apartheid, it was a peace and reconciliation process. Spain, I don't think, has ever had that. So again, it's something that's even now is pretty much under the surface, like the allegiances of your family. And one thing you see across all of these films, I guess, is like figures of authority who are circumspect, kind of corrupt or dangerous, or a good example is maybe the two cops in like the buddy cop movie that's inside of Law of Desire. The kind of straight, ambitious young cop in a suit, and then the kind of old haggard cop who's been around the beat a few times, and he kind of does the coke that's in Pablo's apartment, and the young cop is above
Mega
that.
alcoholic.
And he's like, no, I'm not going to touch that. I've got my eyes on higher office. But then, as soon as he kind of finds out about his sexuality, about homosexuality, he just calls them queers, and then wants to shoot them at one point. It's the other cop who restrains him from pulling his gun out and shooting Banderas on the balcony at the end of the film. So there's all these like this veneer of civility and appropriateness in society, but it doesn't take much to kind of dig underneath it to pull out all of these kind of like this violent kind of like these waves of violence. That was quite interesting to me, even though it was like a little capsule narrative in like a bigger film. It really wasn't about those cops at all. I thought their behavior and their reaction to Pablo's life, whatever, was really interesting.
Let's talk about Law of Desire, which is another film which has this kind of very rhyming narrative. It involves a theatre director putting on Jean Cocteau's The Human Voice, and in his own life, which is a play about someone kind of hanging on the telephone to a lover that's who's spurning her, and in his own life he has a kind of correspondence with this lover Juan who doesn't feel the same way about him, and then enter Banderas, and I guess I just really want to talk about Banderas throughout these films, and indeed onto Skin I Live In. Like, he just is absolutely terrifying, and he's just really really dead-eyed, really sort of kind of like a cat or something, just like not very,
like a cow,
not like actively aggressive, but just very, very unnerving and self-pitying.
Apparently Almodovar talks about how like Antonio Banderas' like acting style. Like he treated Antonio sort of like a kid, but then Antonio said something about how like he wasn't insulted by that. Like he feels like he's sort of in Almodovar's kind of white canvas, and like he was just able to kind of like channel like Almodovar's kind of vision. But
yeah, he does have an amazing like naivety. He's like an animal in those films, in a way that he isn't in Pain and Glory. In Pain and Glory, he's much more composed and.
But then with other actors and actresses that Almodovar works with, he like heavily rehearsed a lot. Mm-hmm. So I found that like really interesting, and then it's also like that kind of he develops his female characters so much more than the male. I guess because he grew up around women, and I think it's really. I think that's sort of interesting. I always just want to kind of read into the psychology of him as a person. And
although the funny thing is that that's the first thing that everyone says about his films is like women. They're all about women. And I wonder how true that is. I think maybe it's just that we're not used to men putting any women in films.
Oh no, I think he relates. I feel like he relates to women more than
but he
men.
did. Sure, but he did say this thing about. He said women make better characters. They are more spectacular as dramatic subjects. They have a greater range of registers.
But he also has a lot of films with male leads in them. Is my point? Like Bad Education, Talk to Her, The Skin I Live In, Pain and Glory, Matador. Like,
and they're all psychopaths.
Yeah, the women are objects of desire. They might like, in a way, because he's been accused of being like misogynistic as well, right? Because he fetishizes women's like violence towards women, and that's often like quite an essential, like in the Banderas films, that's quite an essential thing, right? Because tie me up, tie me down, or whatever, like he's variously just inflicting pain on women.
I found a good quote actually.
Go on.
He said that about The Skin I Live In, I spoke in a very direct way through the character. He's a psychopath, close to what it is to be a director. He noted that Truffaut once defined a director as someone who is driving a train without brakes and trying to keep it on the tracks.
That's so funny.
Wow.
I also feel like a lot of the psychopath characters, I don't know, it seems like it's like if their issues were all directed towards art, they would be great artists. And like in Tie Me Up, Tie Me Down, do you remember when he like gives her a painting and then, or like it's like a work on art on paper, and then he does the map of his life as a subway route. And
they're all sublimating their like repressed anger through violence or something like violence, right? But that's what I was saying the other day on the WhatsApp, that in a way that Banderas character in him in other films, he kind of is like this moral center of the film in a morally bankrupt world. He is actually often the most sincere character. It just happens that in a world where there's no real sincerity, that sincerity comes across in its extreme as something completely absurd and alien. In Law of Desire and Tie Me Up, Tie Me Down, both occasions, he's like completely earnest. Like he's not really hiding anything. I mean, to an extent,
he just wants to be treated as a normal person.
And the tragedy of Law of Desire is like, obviously in lots of these films, he is the protege to Hitchcock, where he's constantly doing that comparison of the director role to that of a psychopath. And the director in Law of Desire is ultimately the most tragic character, because he's got this man that he's in love with, and who is desperately in love with him, and he can't really see it in front of him. And it seems to be that the art is in the symbol of the typewriter, which he ends up kind of destroying, is the thing that's getting in the way.
This is the narrative. This is the story I want to be sent, right? He literally says, these are the letters I want you to.
This isn't good enough. I'm going to write you a letter, and then you'll sign it and send it back to me.
But in that case, like, art is the prison. It's not the escape.
It's the tragic mediation, isn't it? Because it's like if we could just connect with these people, then maybe we wouldn't need this like medium.
There's another great quote about Law of Desire that I have here, which is he said that it's the interplay of desire. It's rare that two desires meet and correspond. And I thought that was very good. And that very much in line with what I was kind of saying before about the way that he takes the farce as a format and takes it kind of more seriously than we're used to, where it's like, well, what if there are all of these characters and they all have their desires, and let's see how this one plays out. And that's what's so ultimately truthful about it. Like, the farce is like the most contrived setup you can have, really. Well, all the characters meet at the end, but it becomes not contrived by him taking seriously the motivations of people or the characters within all of that.
Yeah, this simple act of and putting it in a new context where, you know, it's just like butting heads with all of these other, or even like in Women on the Verge of a Nervous Breakdown, like how are there all these women who are dealing with their own issues and then they're all ending up in the same place? And
which is always like considered really low art, that kind of thing, when it's like the telenovela, but at the same time it's also pure Shakespeare. Like, that's pretty much how most Shakespeare works.
And one by one they drink the spiked gazpacho and drop out like in an opera.
It's great.
Which is Midsummer Night's Dream.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's weird as well, because like talking about the role of the director, because with his obsession with Jean Cocteau, because like I think his whole life he talks about Jean Cocteau, and you know, he stages Jean Cocteau like in Law of Desire, and when Cocteau was writing that piece in like 1930, 1929, he wrote it because he was tired of on the one, he wanted to punish his actors. That's what he said. He was on one hand wanted to indulge them, but he also wanted to punish them, and this was his revenge. A piece that was completely exposing and open and difficult to perform, but would also satisfy, as he called it, their diva-like characteristics. So there's a lot of like weird ambivalence going on in that text and in Jean Cocteau's life, which Almodovar has recently restaged with Tilda Swinton in a kind of lockdown kind of cinema.
A short film that you can see in theaters and not online.
Yeah, it's bullshit.
Seems a bit dodgy to me.
I suspect Tilda Swinton's led him astray.
It's confusing.
But yeah, it's weird how these.
But Pablo does that, doesn't he? In Pablo forces his sister, not forces, but kind of. Pablo has a relationship with his sister, who's transgender, and he doesn't know the full story about what happened to her, because, as we later find out, she went off with their father and came back, having transitioned and seemingly to win over his love. And so there's this story that he doesn't really quite know the full detail of, and then when he has this car crash and wakes up in the hospital, he doesn't know any of it, and he's sort of told it afresh by his sister. But yeah, it's just, again, like the putting the play on and putting his sister in it is kind of a way of trying to connect with her and trying to get some truth from her, and it's like initially very exciting and then very painful.
Interestingly, he also fell out with Carmen Mora, his lead lady for decades.
And she comes back in Volver,
right? Off.
Yeah, as the ghost.
Yeah.
The off, they're brought back as a ghost.
I mean, that's also the great thing. It's like we're supposed to just accept these kind of absurdities, like the psychic visions that happen in Matador, and then the mother ghost that comes back, and But
that's where he's quite Shakespearean again, because it's, well, I suppose Hamlet in a way, but it's the character appearing as a ghost. It's the character. I'm wearing a dress, so you can't see that you don't know who I am because I'm holding a different hat. It's these kind of absurd misunderstandings, which are then compounded by in Othello, it's somebody putting a handkerchief in somebody else's hand, and they mistake that for the character and then murder them because they think she's cheating on him. It's these little kind of absurd, lacings
like that
of desire.
Shirt,
the
other guy gets killed in the Law of Desire, Hawaiian shirt, the gaudy shirt. So Hitchcock, it's just
it is, and so Shakespearean. It's like because we were talking before about, and I think you guys were talking about like telenovela, and maybe that's something I don't really know anything about, but like, what can you like expand on that a little bit? Like, Almodovar is like a telenovela director.
Yeah, well, I mean, telenovelas, as much as I understand it, are the kind of soap opera format in Spain. that have a very specific kind of gaudy aesthetic to them, and they're beyond melodramatic as a vibe, and often based in these domestic settings, and that's a mass cultural, very insular entertainment form. And so he's obviously riffing off that quite a lot, especially in things like Women on the Verge of a Nervous Breakdown, and through his use of the form of and genre of melodrama, I think. But he's kind of elevating it and taking it even further. Like I think that All About My Mother is really interesting on this front, because it has that Douglas Sirky melodrama vibe going on with it, and it is a film about pure tragedy, about the death of a child, and everything is just so ramped up from the get-go, where he's cutting out all the bits of, I've forgotten who said this funny quote, but it's like cinema is all just about people exiting and entering, and it's like walking through doors and leaving through doors, but he's done the opposite. He's like cut out every entrance and every exit. It's right to, here, sign my will, I'm going to Paris, and then it's just like, right, we're in Paris, blah, blah, blah. So everything's just moving super fast, and then there are these moments when the lead character, the mother in question, just has these moments where she just breaks down in pain, and the pain is felt so intensely, I feel, because it's like the experience of dealing with grief is one where you're like distracted by the world around you, and then suddenly something hits you, and I think that he does that in all of these films, where he builds up this excess, this world with too much in it, and you get adjusted to the absurdity of things. You get adjusted to somebody being like, oh, I've just woken up from a coma and I can't remember anything. Care to explain?
Yeah.
And
which is
it's
great.
not a
It's
thing
great
that you question. He's taken us so far out of the realm of realism that we're in this kind of, we're in the magical zone, and the true kind of mastery of it all is the fact that he manages to do something not superficial with that, and kind of take us to really kind of powerful places.
He uses so many really close up shots framing the face, and I feel like so he's very similar to Fassbender in that way, actually. And like, I mean, for instance, we all were obsessed with that sex scene in Tie Me Up, Tie Me Down. It's like so hot, but it's like literally mostly just their faces. You know, you don't see anything, but you're allowed to kind of project onto the situation and read into their facial expressions, and it's just like saying so much more than a sex scene normally does.
Yeah, it's very frantic almost, that scene. There's like a pulse of like desperation almost in that moment, right? I think it's weird actually what I'm kind of all saying about rooms, trapped rooms, apartments, we mentioned it
also
earlier.
movement of people. It's pretty much, the camera is only ever really motivated by the action going on. It's very kinetic cinema. I mean, he's slightly changed on that front a bit more recently, but certainly in those ones, he wouldn't care to establish mood other than through action.
He has such an incredible flow, like, to all of the films, and I guess it's because he and his brother started their own production company that they're able to go from start to finish with their movies instead of needing to like jump and like conserve like costs here and there. Like they don't have to do it in a certain particular order that would be more cost effective.
No, they film chronologically, do they?
They go from start
That's
to
interesting.
finish.
Nice.
That's really interesting. It's funny how my facile like observation or parallel was with thinking a lot about Goya, and when Goya did his black paintings and pretty much entombed himself in a house to paint the walls of this building that he rented. These are the famous kind of like the Goya paintings you think of, Saturn eating the head of his child. And there's a weird, like, for me, it's a completely meaningless, like, mirror image. But for me, it's like where Goya was kind of trapping himself in this repressed kind of cave of darkness. In a way, kind of Almodovar kind of entombs himself in this prison of light and color, because he's exploring the same things, like the tragedy and violence of Spanish, like, history, cultural history. But like I said earlier, everything is so brought to the surface. And so kind of vibrant, and like you said, Matt, you know, kind of like so about action and bodies, and you were saying, Lucy, about, you know, kind of this intense focus on faces, and he fills that tomb with people, and it's kind of weird because you can't see it coming through. Like we were saying, these films are quite light and easy to watch, but even when they seem to resolve themselves, there's still this undercurrent of deep weirdness, you know, like we were saying earlier, the end of Tie Me Up, Tie Me Down. We see this unification in a way, right? Like the kidnapper is driving away to a happy ending in the car, the sister's there singing along, and we see the woman who's being kidnapped and brutalized and raped. Basically, you know, she looks, I guess, terrified. Is that right? Because, like, you know, all I could look at was her face, you know.
It's a beautifully ambiguous expression, because she's kind of... Yeah, it doesn't. It's probably I mean, that ending is a funny one. It's quite abrupt in a way, that we're getting from her absolutely hating this guy to her being like going actively to meet him, kind of hinges on this one very intense sex scene. But yeah, it's funny actually, because I was reading, like, I was just Googling that film, and there was like a very discoursey like article about like how it's like, you know, like glamorizing violence, whatever. But
I mean, I think that, you know, that's just like idiot brain stuff, isn't it? Because the that's the obvious provocation of what he's doing. Yeah. Like I said, like the best way to respond to, well, a genius way to respond to the era of Franco is with a penis judging competition. Yeah, he's 100%. Also like provocating doing a rape scene in the style of a black and white comedic, like Buster Keaton-y sort of short film. I mean, it's talk to her. And there are so many instances of these things where he takes the most humans at the most brutal, and I think it's rather reductive to say that he's glamorizing. I think that just shows that people don't understand aesthetics when they say that. He's just applying an unusual aesthetic language to one that's creating a disharmony purposefully, where we can maybe, you know, it's not again the art house aesthetic thing of like, well, let's have the 16-minute rape scene here just to show you how nasty it is. That sort of kind of that jarring mismatch of form and content is a perfect way to bring people in, I think, you know. As you said, like there are certain films.
It's the perfect metaphor for a relationship. Tie me up, tie me down.
Yeah, I mean, I think probably what disturbs some people about the way that Almodovar depicts certain acts of violence is that those styles, by being comedic or humorous or light or colourful or unusual, bring the audience closer to those acts and disturbs our kind of our standard response to them. Yeah.
Well, what people are really saying there when they say that this director is aestheticizing violence, aestheticizing kind of abuse or whatever, they're really saying, I enjoyed watching this. Not to mean they condone it, but they, you know, they bought into it as
I'm writing to complain how much I enjoyed watching this.
I really enjoyed this scene. I really got off on the scene. No, but they're buying into the spectacle that's in front of them. And that's why his work is, in that sense, is quite essential, because you're right. You know, the appropriate way to do a post-Franco film is not to make a kind of laborious 8-hour documentary about the crimes. That might have its place, definitely, but to make something that kind of breaks through that wall a little bit, and you know. And what his films do is they celebrate transgression, but they also say we are also really base and really vile,
and it brings it into everyday culture, to each other.
Right? Yeah, absolutely.
Like, using the telenovela. I don't really. Yeah, they're using the telenovela medium. It's funny because I guess in English language countries, Almodovar is relegated to to art house just simply by being foreign, but like these films are pop in so many ways.
And they're huge in Spain.
I would imagine so.
Ralph, what you said about how you think she switched when they finally had sex later in the movie, I actually think it started to happen when he first grabs her and they are like face to face.
And when she says,
and she's like, wait, what, you want to fuck me, you know?
And then she says, just get it over with then. And he's like, no, that will come later. in this very calm and measured way.
And I think that it's, so beautifully done because there's this really slow, like, switch that happens. And it's sort of, and that's where it's kind of like this beautiful metaphor for a relationship and sort of like the expectations that we each have, like, getting to know each other, and like when you are trying to figure out and navigate if your feelings are, more severe than your partner's, and, or just like when trust comes into play. And, it's, of course, it's like made obvious that she realized that she does remember having sex with him when they finally fuck, and she's like fully like, wrapped up in him, and maybe it's suddenly unequal or something, but I don't know. I mean,
that's true, because they actually take refuge from the world together quite quickly. Like I know I'm not going to talk about Stockholm syndrome, it's not that, it's in their mutual kind of dependency. She has a dependency, which is that she is a drug addict who is kind of pretty much like sidelined by the production company that's shooting this film. Like she's quite an unhappy, desolate person. He has a need, which is her, and these kind of, even though they're totally woefully mismatched, the actual, like, the objective that both people have is completely mismatched in each other, but they find a kind of weird equilibrium. And it does, it forms this kind of like buddy movie where they are they're both interested in prolonging the illusion of the delusion of the tying up, like her kidnapping. She kind of buys into it in a way. It's weird, kind of like it transcends everything that's happening in the film, which is weird. Obviously that might just be because she's trying to survive, but it feels a bit more ambivalent than that. And I like that Almodovar was kind of exploring that ambivalence, like they were kind of working together to prolong her kidnap.
I guess that's the interesting thing about the kind of tone that he operates in, which is far removed from realism, like melodrama or whatever we call it, is that things aren't as simple as allegory or metaphor. They're existing on like several planes at the same time. So literally she's tied up to a bed. Yep. But then there's all this other stuff going on, and it's not like kind of that recent, it's not like Midsummer, like actually this means that it's all just like an illusion, which is a very contemporary mode of thinking, or like way of operating in
where
film,
the metaphor has to be like some kind of cryptic clue that you unlock and talk about afterwards.
It's actually about loss, it's actually about racism, it's actually about blah blah blah, which is very reductive way of thinking of the world, but it's really operating on all of these levels at the same time, on a very literal one and a very I even very think that one.
Antonio Banderas' character being named Ricky is even referencing I Love Lucy. And like, when he announces his arrival, he's like, I'm home, and like, it's like, Lucy, I'm home. And it's like, he's thinking that he's calming her because he's just like kind of this like psychopath animal type character. And like, she's at that point, she was still like, tied up and terrified and trying to,
Do you?
That's crucial. It's also funny. Like all his films are like really funny.
Those moments where they're in the bathroom together and they're like, and he's like, I really like this, like
the shaving or whatever.
Is there a point where you start rooting for him? That's the interesting question. Because for a
he's so charming the whole way.
From the beginning,
it's hard not to.
I found it like I think identified mostly with her and felt like I was really like, come on, get out, this is awful. And then, but there are glimmers of like, oh god, he's so funny,
I definitely feel like I related more with him. He's like
Interesting.
a psychopath.
But when he gets his shit kicked out of him, he's when he gets beaten up by the drug dealers, more for him. He did mug one of them. But he's beaten up, and there's a moment of real tenderness when he comes home, and
that's when it really starts to switch gears.
And he doesn't seek her affection. He's not going to her, heal my wounds. He's kind of turning up like a wounded animal, and he wants to crawl under into a dark corner, and she volunteers the caring for him, because she's like, in a way, she's saying we're both losers, which is true. Like they both are, in their own way. It's great.
Well, and he's rescuing her out of sort of this life in oblivion where she's just getting high all the time. And has
she's
this director who's obsessed with her,
Yeah, the weird scene when he's watching porn of her, because she used to be a porn star, and his
And he must have
wife.
shot that. So it's
Yeah.
like, it's like he's just he's so good at every
It's not
little
implied,
mise en scène,
Oh yeah, which is one of my pet gripes in films, which is when films show another film in them, or if they show TV, how off it normally feels.
Yeah.
And Almodovar nails it every time. Yeah. I love the woman talking about the terrorists in Women on the Verge.
Oh god, yeah, in Women on the Verge.
That's classic.
Yeah.
There's this old woman, this like pensioner. She's just looking down at the sheet of paper like she's in a hostage situation or something, just like reading out these headlines. It's so beautifully low rent.
Which one was it where there's like a gunshot on the TV as there's like a gunshot? Like I watched so many in the last 2 days that I'm like, wait, which one was that? Because they all have the same little tricks, but and a neighbor was like, oh no, it was just like simultaneously on the TV. Like I don't think that's a real gunshot. I think it was was it Women on the Verge? I don't know. Fuck. This is sort of like what I love most about Matador, like how these sort of certain moments really punctuate certain like actions, and when the whole eclipse like story happens it's like when the retired Matador and the lawyer character, like the two bullfighters are doing their simultaneous love death scene, like that's when the eclipse happens, and like the group the group with the cops and the therapist and and the Ava, the model ex-lover, like all their attention like turns to the eclipse, and the screen just like shifts color, it's just so visceral, and like he's even like putting in screens of like full screens of red. He even does that again in Pain and Glory, but he does it twice in Matador. It's like he's just like he has all these he uses a lot of the same tricks throughout, and that's what makes me feel like he just has such a like wonderful like style, and he is really kind of creating these films with like this sort of in this sort of like subconscious way. Like he doesn't really fully plan it all out, but I think there are certain things that he does that are just so painterly.
So what don't we like about him? We don't have to.
That's a question for you, Owen.
Oh well,
we say
he's made some bad films.
Oh, I'm so excited! It's a bad film.
Yeah,
I always forget that I've seen that, but yeah.
And Broken Embraces is weak.
Yeah, that one was not.
They were made quite close together, right? Like, but then he made The Skin I Live In around that time, which
in
is
between them, and that's great. Yeah.
I mean, that many films, there's got to be some duds. That's just.
And I think also one thing that's interesting about him, like as Lucy was saying, I was just trying to rack my brain and just remember the intricacies of all of them. Like you guys are much better at remembering the plots of the ones we've just seen than I am.
Yeah, I'm so
like, I love The Flower of My Secret, but I can only remember a few of the bits.
So many.
But it's really because they are all one film ultimately.
Yeah.
And I think I mentioned this before, saying that I know that I'm probably the only one here who likes Ozu films. And obviously they're
I haven't given much time.
they're very different. They couldn't be any more different. Extremely minimal. But he is also somebody who made an unbelievable amount of films, and they're all very, very similar. And I think what's particularly interesting with Ozu, but you also get it with old Pedro, is the things that are left out in between these, because when you've made so many films and you're hammering that, I think there are one big one that I was just thinking of is children. Now there are a few films that have children in them. There is a child character in Law of Desire who's very funny, and there are babies about, and there's
but
like
she's
ideas
basically an
that,
adult in that film.
Yeah, the only one that really delves into it is Bad Education, where that's like the site of extreme trauma, and I think it's quite interesting.
He says that one's also kind of the most autobiographical. I guess before he did Pain and Glory, that was the most autobiographical.
I think you can see that childhoods are there in his films, and they are driving the motivations of the characters we see, yet we rarely actually
100%.
witness the things themselves, and that seems like a purposeful omission. And I think that it's quite interesting when you look at somebody as consistent as him, like what is he like also missing
Why
out
are you choosing
here?
to
And
I think it's
that becomes interesting.
You're right, because in a way in say Law of Desire, it's their childhood growing up, and you see some photographs of them, the brother and sister when they were young. It was obviously a really formative period in their lives that shaped everything that's happened since. Now, he doesn't revisit. It's always this thing that is, we don't see maybe the character in Tie Me Up, Tie Me Down. We don't see his entry to the mental hospital, because he's quite young. He's being discharged at age 23, I think. So he's obviously been in there for some time, institutionalized for years as a child.
He's shagging the matron.
He's shagging the matron, which is a really great scene, actually. But the kind of the well of repression and trauma is kind of swimming around under all of this. And maybe it's because, Almodovar's films, he's always kind of working out his own life in his cinema, and maybe childhood is something that's too painful for him.
Yeah, I mean, totally. Like the child we have at the beginning of All About My Mother, who is very like Almodovar himself. I think he's talking about Cocteau and filmmaking and things like that. He dies, and the whole film is in the wake of that. The Skin I Live In has this flashback to the genesis of the story that we're then seeing that only happens halfway through it. And I think it's kind of rare that as well, because childhood is so fetishized, and children are so fetishized within cinema.
Absolutely.
Because for obvious reasons, it's like the developmental phase really kind of fits well with storytelling and things being unearthed. Yet it's kind of something that sets him apart, that he makes adult film for adults, which are very fun.
And often the adults are very childlike. I mean, I guess the obvious example is Banderas, who it just still sticks with me. I watched it last night. Like when what's her face, Marina, the actress, says, "You're pathetic. I'm never going to fall in love with you. Like, I hate you." And he just kind of doesn't really say anything, and like recedes a bit, and then he sort of comes back and he's like, "That was very mean of you to say that, that was, to call me pathetic. I mean, you've really got to see this from my point of view, And he's sort of like a child, like negotiating, like, and Banderas' characters in all those films just has this real, like, I mean, Luci alluded to it earlier in the acting style. Like, it's really unself-conscious. It's really like watching. It's like if you brought like a child or an animal onto the screen who doesn't quite know that they're being watched in that same way, isn't trying to kind of be polite, isn't trying to correct themselves, and that's like the most compelling thing to watch. I mean, James Dean in the few films he was in had that kind of quality as well, like a very, very childlike, very sort of like naive, very reactive, and that's in,
I feel
in a
like
way
he
perfect for cinema.
modeled Antonio Banderas sort of after James Dean, actually.
Absolutely.
And in Matador, I noticed there was the James Dean like postcard like on one of the mirrors, and I was like, that's literally one that I had.
And it's,
in my
he's put it
bedroom
there,
growing up.
you know.
It was just, yeah, he always, like, every little thing that he puts in the set has like sort of some sort of meaning that relates to his upbringing, childhood, and like sort of his approach, I think.
But it's funny because with children, typically in films, their role is to encounter the norms of the adult world that to them are strange, and the viewer often, you know, is invited to see the world through their eyes, and whether that's horrors or beauty, you know, maybe Ivan's childhood, Tarkovsky, for example, you know, Ivan experiencing war, and you have to have the child's mind to experience the absurdity of it almost. Whereas in Almodovar's films, it's the adults who are, yeah, like we were saying, in this state of arrested development almost, and they are the ones discovering the absurdity of the world, almost literally in Law of Desire, because Pedro has a literal concussion where he forgets everything and becomes a child again. He has to relive his childhood from his sister explaining it to him in the bed. You know, he becomes a little infant again. He doesn't, you know, he says, what was I? He says, you were a filmmaker. And like, did I make good films? He was like, you made wonderful films. Which is obviously this coded moment as well, because the doctor, you know, is obviously gay, or, you know, and he's kind of like, that's why he acts to save him when he tips off the sister and says, you know, remove the drugs or anything incriminating from the apartment. And again, it's like this well of things that you can't really talk about. And for a director who's so on the nose and surfaces, like I was saying at the beginning, so much, there's certain things he keeps hidden, and those are the things that may be most painful or most difficult in a way.
I think also one of the classic things of the coming of age is that you have a protagonist who starts in one way and then they undergo a radical shift by the end, and that makes for a compelling drama. But the reality of life as we know it is people don't change that much, and I think that his characters often don't change that much. Their motivations just maybe start to align with one another in a warped and strange way. Yeah. And he has a lot of he places emphasis on like transgender characters and upon an idea of like fluidity in all of its forms, as like forms of like other forms of being. And it's like he's got characters that sort of flirt with it, but some kind of can completely change, but a lot of the times they don't, which is what makes the kind of comedy and the tragedy so apparent, in the kind of classic fast way.
Totally.
They often try to change and just end up on square one.
Yeah, they see the world as it is sometimes, but that is not enough to kind of drag them out of their torpor or like to change their trajectory, right? They just kind of either die or continue, albeit differently.
Yeah, he seems to really believe in like that everyone has like a fate that's sort of mapped out for them. And in Julieta, like the daughter, like her, I guess she grows up to then have like a son who drowns in water, and like her father, you know, died at sea, and it's just like, you know, like he deliberately makes these certain decisions in the story to like kind of add this sort of maybe repetition and you know, like add this like kind of like exaggerated thematic element.
I'm aware of time, as pleasant as this is, but I'm thinking it would be quite fun. Favorite Almodovar film? Go.
Well, before this pod, I think it was Talk to Her, but I think now it might be Matador.
Right.
Cool.
What's that? Okay.
Well, you guys know that I put Matador on my top 10, but
this
honestly,
is why we're doing all this. Is
honestly, I after like watching Tie Me Up, Tie Me Down, finally like a full, from the beginning to end, because for some reason it's like one that I always play when I'm like really tired and exhausted. So I've seen like the beginning maybe like 10 times.
That's great that when you feel tired and exhausted, you watch a film about a kidnapping. That's like perfect.
I was like watching it under extreme exhaustion, but so it has nothing to do with the story, but putting me to sleep. But they're really tied for me, I think. But Matador, for like, I think hits all the notes, like, and like he's like sort of so. I mean, it's just like such a pleasure, and it always goes so fast, and it's like, you want like another hour, but and the music is just like so fun and energetic, and like that scene where he Almodovar does this cameo as the fashion designer, and it's like telling, the other models, like, well, if you're gonna do like heroin, at least shoot up in the bathroom. And, like there are all these like sort of like slapstick moments, but then there are these like dark like moments cut with like really intense, romance. And I don't know. It's just there. I mean, there's just so many great lines, but then ultimately, with those sort of like shifts in light, I don't know. That one just like comes to the forefront for me. But
yeah, the eclipse is phenomenal.
I agree, though. Law of Desire too. It's just like you can't choose one, but you can. I think that like I guess I'm choosing this period in the 80s as my favorite.
Funnily enough, I actually think that Matador is like a lesser Almodovar film, because it doesn't, to me, have the things that I get so excited by. It does seem a little bit more in the vein of other films that were made around that time, the kind of Cronenberg-y kind of crash element of it. Whereas I like the kind of mixture of comedy and tragedy, which it doesn't play out quite so much in the absolute vibrancy of those. It just has a very certain, like, it's the darker one. For me, I think that Talk to Her is clearly a masterpiece, just because of the way it combines so many of these elements together in such an unexpected way. It's just a really unusual plot that's going on, and set of characters, and even the Matador scene in that I prefer to the Matador scenes in Matador. It's it has this like vibrancy to it, and there's this comedy that shifts into tragedy, which ultimately creates for this like icky and very profound ending, and it has like this
it's
musical,
surreal in a less hokey way.
it has this musical interlude, which he does in a lot, and it's just the placement of that, just like the form of it all, the form of that film is really muscular, and kind of, I've never seen anything that is quite like it. I also think that, like, Women on the Verge and Tie Me Up, Tie Me Down, there is a kind of vibrancy and energy to those that just feels so radical and refreshing still today. So I heavily rate those. It's also difficult because there are certain films that are, they're weighted in the sense that they're favorites or something, and I think there are some that are forgotten about, such as The Flower of My Secret, which I think is a really great film. But Talk to Her is my pick.
Oh, very good pick. We reviewed it on the pod many months ago.
Not that I remember.
And it is, I guess, like quite a sort of it's in contrast to the ones we've been talking about. Like, it has a slightly more restrained, it's slightly less cartoonish, but it goes for the same like extremes and the same moral kind of ecstasy. Owen, what's your fave?
I don't know. Like, Matt, I echo you saying Matador you enjoyed less. I kind of enjoyed it less as well. Maybe because it felt like less perfect encapsulation of what he's getting towards at that period. Whereas Tie Me Up, Tie Me Down, for me, felt like the best model of that. Like, and it's, you know, Law of Desire kind of meanders a bit and kind of gets lost in the rapids for a while, because it develops the characters in kind of a way that I felt at times a bit boring, kind of like lost interest. But Tie Me Up, Tie Me Down, I was fully transfixed the whole film. It felt a lot tighter and felt a lot kind of like it wasn't pulling its punches at all. You know, he was really going for it. Whereas, you know, I think Matador is a more serious film and kind of falters because it is trying to be exaggerated and serious at the same time. And I think Law of Desire was a bit like that. And it was trying to kind of have this kind of
I don't think of Matador as serious at all.
I felt it was, but you know, again, I'm
Matador.
Yeah, I don't know. I just didn't feel it felt like the register and the tonality of it was more serious. The composition, it felt like it was still trying to be like a serious art house film in how it looked, whereas the televisual sense of like Tie Me Up, Tie Me Down, and it's full on like it was climbing onto the kind of rodeo horse of absurdity. That's what worked for me. Like that's purely on sense of like which one did I enjoy the most. Yeah, I think so. Yeah, thank me.
I once had lunch at the BFI. End of story. No. I just kind of trying to show off after coronavirus about things I used to do.
Yeah.
And it was Almodovar season going on there. And this woman walked into the restaurant and I didn't see her face, but she was wearing like a full bright pink suit and this like jet black hair in this crazy kind of sculptural thing going on. And I turned to my friend and I was like, well, she's in the right place for Almodovar season. And she sits down and it was Rossi de Palma.
Oh my god! I was literally just gonna guess, was it Rossi?
Yeah, I was guessing Rossi as well.
And she sat right on the table next to me. I was like, wow, okay, this is very cool. And then her guest arrives, and it was Pedro Almodovar who sat there. And so I had an entire dinner right next to them.
Oh my god!
Like on the tables, and I am a mega fan, as has been made clear. But clearly was also not going to interrupt them.
Of course not.
On the dinner. But
I presume they
really
were talking
savoured the moment.
Spanish.
There was a funny.
I assume they were talking Spanish, so you couldn't overhear what they were.
Yeah, exactly.
I read something in the Almo book that I guess Rossi de Palma was really bored on the set of Women on the Verge of a Nervous Breakdown, and she complained to Pedro about it, and that's why he wrote in that scene where when she's blacked out from the spiked gazpacho, has like a sex tree.
Right.
So that's how she got to get
That's great. More plots should be decided by people being bored on set and like demanding.
Yeah.
For listeners who haven't guessed, Rossi de Palma is the very unusual, striking-looking woman from most
unforgettable face.
Extraordinary face. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, Matt. Thank you, Lucy. Cheers for joining us for this.
Pleasure. Thanks for
this
having
celebration.
Yeah. Was I the first female on the Moob Tube?
I think so.
Perfectly fitted for Almodovar.
We finally opened up to women on this program, and I think it was okay. I think it was a
like
success.
Oxford College.
How many female directed films have you discussed?
Yeah,
quite a lot.
Don't bring your discourse.
First
here.
review was a Claire Denis film,
yeah,
High Life. We did the Bryant special. We did Kelly Reichardt.
Bryant.
We did
Bryant. Yeah.
But no, obviously more
all
men
the
than
good
women.
ones. All the good ones.
Yeah, thank you for listening, listeners. Next week we'll be on
Godard.
talking about Godard. We'll be doing part 2 of Godard. This time it's Marxism. And,
extra boo.
Yeah,
It's the best.
I'm sure you'll all be tuning in. All right,
you guys might have to invite Matt again.
Yeah.
To diss Godard's Maoist period. Yeah.
I haven't even watched any of his Maoist periods, so
it's better to keep it that way.
Well, this next week is going to be that is going to
tune in and find out next time on MoveTube.